think that actually segues. I think that actually segues really neatly into this next session, where we'll be talking about equality, diversity, and inclusion. So I'm just expecting some slides to appear on the screen any moment. There we go. So yeah, today's session, second session today, is about equality, diversity, and inclusion in English schools. Whilst in the previous session we launched a full new report, in this session we don't have a finished report to share with you, but we do have some very hot off the press data. So we are in an early stage of working on the next report in our equality, diversity, and inclusion series. Yeah, we have the kind of privilege of sharing some of that early data with you today, and then we'll be breaking for a discussion with some experts in the field. So if we now go through and have a quick meet the speakers, we're going to start hearing some data from our colleague at Jurjo, Jurgis Kaunins. Jurgis is, by day, he is our digital marketing manager. He looks after our marketing channels and provides insights on topics relating to equality, diversity, and inclusion. But as a queer activist at heart with a passion for marketing, he also leads Safe Space, which is a Latvia-based non-profit organisation facilitating local and international projects with a focus on LGBTQ+ issues, implicit biases, intersectionality, and trans-inclusive feminism. Jurgis will be sharing some data with us today, and then we'll be having a chat with Zahara and Hannah. Zahara is EDI business partner at university. She's also the founder of the blog and podcast Schools Should Be, which explores a diverse range of topics and issues that should be at the centre of education. Zahara has written widely about diversity in education for SecEd, the Chartered College, Schools Week, and Diverse Ed. Previously, she has held the role of Head of Diversity and Inclusion across a couple of secondary schools, also been Head of English, Associate Senior Leader, Wellbeing and Education Consultant. Zahara regularly leads diversity and inclusion workshops and advice for schools and workplaces. And our third speaker is Hannah. Hannah Wilson is a leadership development consultant, coach, and trainer. She's a former executive head of 2 startup schools and has held roles in teaching schools as a MAT trustee and in governance. She's passionate about DEIB and strives to be an inclusive ally, advocating for representation across the sector. She's co-founder of WomenEd, Diverse Ed, and the director of Diverse Educators. And with that, I'll hand over to Jurgis to talk you through some of the data.
Hi, everyone. The long story short, the Jurjo Equality Diversity Survey has been running for 3 years now. And in that time, we've gathered responses from over 26,000 school staff. So let's take a look at some of the main highlights so far, and brace yourselves for a lot of important charts. I mean, who doesn't love a good graph? The survey itself covers topics related to, first of all, recruitment, the on-the-job experience, and advancement of those 26,000 staff members. And as you can see on the right side of the slide, we gather information on each respondent's protected characteristics as outlined by the Equality Act 2010 to enable us to have a look at how people of different backgrounds experience their time within both schools as well as trusts. So overall, the picture of EDI is pretty positive. If we look at the overall commitment to EDI, we can see that 78% of staff believe that their workplace is committed to EDI. We can also see that 68% of staff believe that all staff are treated equally, whereas for inclusion aspects, 76% believe that their workplace is inclusive. And moving forward to feeling valued and the feelings of belonging, 66% of staff feel valued in their workplace. It's also worth noting here that 11% feel not very or not at all valued. And looking at diversity, that one has a less positive picture, with 45% believing that their staff body is diverse and only 28% believing that their leadership is diverse. So that's the overall picture. let's take a look at some of those differences based on people's protected characteristics. We'll be looking at, first of all, disability status, then gender identity, sexual orientation, ethnicity, and last but not least, seniority within respondents' organization. So if we look at disability, it's worth noting that disabled staff have a significantly different experience to non-disabled staff. For example, 8 in 10 non-disabled staff are confident that their workplace is committed to EDI, whereas for disabled staff, only 6 in 10 respondents feel the same. Similarly, when looking at equality, the sense of equal treatment is a lot higher for non-disabled staff. And as for inclusion, disabled staff do not agree with their non-disabled colleagues to the same extent that their workplace is inclusive, committed to EDI, or that staff are treated equally. And we can also see that if we look at belonging, that only half, 54% to be exact, of disabled staff feel valued in their workplace, which is significantly lower than their colleagues. And there are also notable differences between staff of different sexual orientations and gender identities. First, let's take a look at gender identity. Pardon me. So first, looking at gender identity, men were the most confident that our workplace is committed to EDI. Women were slightly less confident, and those with a gender identity other than male or female were much less confident. The trend is consistent across all the key areas. So for instance, men are the most positive regards their confidence of equal staff treatment in their workplace. The same goes for inclusion, with those identifying as neither male or female reporting significantly lower numbers. And furthermore, less than half of staff with that gender identity other than male or female report feeling valued. And the difference between heterosexual and gay, lesbian, bisexual, and pansexual staff is smaller than when we look at other protected characteristics. However, it is still the case that those from the sort of non-heterosexual communities are less positive than their straight or heterosexual colleagues. And again, that can be observed for all 3 main key areas. First of all, feelings of equal treatment. Second of all, also when we look at belonging, the perceptions of being valued and in their workplace also differ slightly less than for other protected characteristics, but the trend is still there. And the same goes for belonging. Yep. And we also saw that staff of different ethnicities report different feelings of equality, inclusion, and belonging. Overall, we have observed that almost 80% of white staff agree that their workplace is dedicated to promoting EDI, whereas all other ethnic groups, including mixed groups and those identifying as Asian or Asian British, agree less, with those of Black, African, Caribbean backgrounds faring considerably lower. Similar trends, again, can be observed when talking about equality, as well as inclusion and belonging. And interestingly, that the percentages for all of these questions were similar throughout the results when specifically looking at ethnicity. And finally, we found that senior leaders are more likely to believe that their organization's commitment to EDI is actually working. So looking at the overall commitment, we can see that 94% of senior leaders, so that's the bottom graph, the bottom right graph, believe their workplace is committed to EDI compared to 78% of staff overall. We can see this perception gap across equality and inclusion too. And when looking at belonging, we can see that almost 90%, so 89% of senior leaders feel valued compared to 66% of staff overall. So the upper graph is staff overall. Long story short, intro to the data set. We will be producing a full report in the upcoming months, so keep your eyes on your inbox and sign up to get notified within homeedurio.com/insights, and we will let you know once it's available. But for now, let's open the floor for discussions. Iona, back to you.
Thank you very much, Yagis, and yeah, Zahara and Hannah, time to welcome you into the discussion as well. I'm going to start with a question which is for both of you, so either one of you feel free to jump right in. But Yagis just talked us through some of the kind of really important findings from the data, and highlighted some significant differences between staff with different protected characteristics. Here we looked at disability, sexual orientation, gender identity, and ethnicity. And I guess the question is, how do we, it's a big question, so I'm going to start broad, and then we can dive in a little bit afterwards. But how do we make sure that nobody is left behind in an increasingly diverse workspace?
Hannah, it's that moment where who goes? Thank you for having me. And yeah, it was really interesting results that you had, because like you said, the overall picture looks quite positive when you look at your data. And I was quite surprised when I first saw the positivity. But when you sort of go a little bit more granular, how do you ensure that you've got that level of inclusion? I think it's important to ensure that those voices are being heard in the right places. So when it comes to creating that sense of inclusion for global majority staff or people from marginalized backgrounds within the profession, much of it, I think, is about, as much as they might be able to see, or we can all see that things, you know, EDI is being taken seriously, or there is a policy, there are events, etc. It's more about the impact it's having. So it's important to have them in spaces and to have individuals in spaces where conversations are around impact. So that would be, I would say, at middle and senior level, where there are discussions around policy, around consistent practices across schools and workplaces. But I'll hand over to Hannah now as well.
I think my lens is really sort of like thinking about the language of how we even talk about different people, that we tend to lump anyone who's different into a group of letters. So anyone who is not heterosexual is LGBTQI+, anyone who is not white is BAME. And I think that's where we need to start, is actually thinking about the language we are using and how inclusive that language is. When we refer to the non-teachers in our school, that is othering anyone who's not a teacher, when we're referring to the non-white people, the non-heterosexual people. So I think starting with the language of inclusion is really, really important. And there's lots there to think about with the data, but the bit that really jumps out to me is the experience of people who are Black within the sector. So there's been a massive focus on racial representation in the last couple of years, but when you look at that data, the experience of Black people versus brown people is very different. And we are underrepresented, under-recruiting, under-retaining people who identify as being Black specifically. So I think the conversations we've been having about racism, anti-racism, racial equity in the last few years, we now need to be thinking about colorism as that next colour layer. Because I don't think everyone understands the difference between racism and colorism, and thinking about representation of different people with different skin tones is a really important part of this work as well. And when we look at the data around who gets recruited into the sector, who gets retained in the sector, who gets promoted in the sector, Black men are one of the most marginalised groups within the education sector. When we then look at the experience of Black boys within our schools and who gets excluded, I think there's some real unpicking to be done there about how the different data sets actually speak to each other.
Lovely, thank you very much. And I wonder if you can share, obviously without going into details about who's doing it, but is there anywhere you've seen where for either that kind of middle leader piece and that kind of, yeah, where we can have the impact, or on the kind of Black and versus brown and the colorism efforts? So there are any kind of really strong examples you've seen within the sector, or actually outside of the sector, where there's people are doing some stuff that's really, really having the impact that we need?
I'll jump in with the follow-up from my bit then, and then hand back over to Sahara. So one of the tools we've got on our website is what we call the DEI directory, and we've got 188 organisations who are doing DEI work in schools, and you can search by A to Z, but you can search by race. And if you go to the race section, there are now about 30 organisations doing the work specifically on race. I would say the majority of them are actually in the grassroots space, because things aren't happening within the system. People of colour are taking this into their own hands and they're setting up their own CICs, their own charities. So organisations we need to be aware of, we need to be collaborating with are BayMed, Black Men Teach, Aspiring Heads, Mix Ed. They are all listed on our website. Some organisations are particularly leading with it. So I'd say like the Chiltern Learning Trust in Luton are a really good example of how they're really committed to this work. They've hosted an annual racial equity networking dinner for the last few years. I'm going in July and there's 350 people going for that conversation. So I think that their work started when they got the DfE funding through the equality grants, and that funding's obviously gone. So I think there's a piece there for us to be thinking about how are we, if we identify as being white, how are we deliberately networking and going outside of our bubble to actually connect with people in other areas. And I think I just saw something coming through in the chat about non-diverse areas, because this idea of white majority spaces comes up as a problem a lot of the time. Like I was brought up in Devon, I do a lot of work in Dorset, in Norfolk or Suffolk, like the areas in the country where we know there's less racial representation. So the work is harder in conjunction to race in those spaces, but it's as important, or should I say more important, because we are preparing young people to go out into workplaces, universities, into communities where they are going to be mixing with people of colour, and they might not experience that in their upbringing. So how do we actually make sure that we are doing that work within our school context?
Yeah, and I guess to follow on potentially from like the bottom up approach as well, like I think it comes down to things like looking at just I know we hear it a lot, but representation across your curriculum and the places and the people, your students, and specifically your Black students, as well as, you know, Asian boys, who are they seeing? Who are they learning about? What are they experiencing more locally as well? And increasing that representation by, like Hannah said, engaging with organizations. And I would almost say look to social media as well. Like, so from an influencer standpoint, there are so many great influencers out there who students are looking at and almost following outside of their school environment. And it's important to look at ways of bringing them into your organization as well. So I know that, you know, I would say if you were to even engage with Stephen Bartlett's podcast, which I'm sure many of us might listen to, the guests that he's had on his podcast, and then looking at their change, like in terms of engaging with them. And they do, you know, I've reached out to them when I was in a school role, and they do get in touch, and you can engage with them for your students to then increase the representation that way from a student perspective. So I think that's really important. In terms of that, going to that question about at the same time to preparing students for a more global life, it is, you know, Hannah used the word deliberate. You know, I've worked in areas where there is a lack of ethnic diversity, and I think it is really important and you know, I've worked in schools which are of a high South Asian population too. So I think it's really important to engage with schools in other areas, in other counties, and collaborate. And interestingly, I've been doing some work with schools in and around Bucks, and specifically with boys, and they have said to me, and again, I know it comes down to the practicalities for schools, but they have acknowledged how much their schools are doing with regards to EDI, but what they have all requested is more collaboration with other schools. And they've all said it would be great to talk to students at other schools. So if you're thinking more around amplifying, like Hannah spoke about, leadership and engaging from that kind of strategic point of view from a leadership level, but strategically when you're thinking of a student perspective and trying to amplify and diversify their perspectives with their peers, because we know that peer-to-peer support, it's very effective, like that one-to-one, like kind of the influence it has, and the kind of the voices that they listen to, creating those conferences, or even, you know, mirroring the racial equity dinner, but for students. Beaconsfield High, where I was working as their head of DEI, the student leadership team there engaged 6 other local schools to have roundtable discussions around EDI, and they invited student leaders from Key Stage 4 and Key Stage 5 5 to come together. So the school effectively acted as the facilitators, and SLT took on their ideas and views around EDI and the things that they were looking for more locally to drive forward this work. So I hope that sort of answers it from the student perspective as well.
Lovely, thank you. And yeah, I was at a different conference a few weeks ago, and someone raised the point around social media that we talked about, Hannah, you growing up in Devon, and the area is not particularly racially diverse, and we do hear, well, there's nothing we can do because the area is not racially diverse, and the pushback or the challenge that was presented a couple of weeks ago was, well, when we were growing up, there wasn't infinite access to everybody around the world. You might not be seeing kind of people of all different races, of all different kind of backgrounds in the way that children are today, because they have access to social media and they have all of those things. And I love what you mentioned, Sahara, about kind of diversifying the curriculum and making sure that is seen. We actually have in our pupil survey, we have some data around how much the pupils see someone that looks like them within their lessons, and I think it is really, really important. So thank you very much for sharing that. I will mention we've had a couple of questions in the chat, but do keep sharing, because I'll be able to field those to the team as well as we go. So yeah, the next thing I wanted to chat about is we saw the differences between kind of that majority and marginalized groups, and those kind of clear differences in belonging and other areas. I want to talk specifically about the equality question. So in each of those slides around equality that Jörgis shared, we could see that the majority group was more confident than the marginalized group, that everyone in their workplace is treated equally. How do we get past that? If we're in a situation where those in the majority, or those with that perhaps might have the higher impact, and we saw the same with senior leaders, that senior leaders are more confident everyone's treated equally, they're more confident that their workplace is committed to equality, diversity and inclusion. If those who kind of have that power, either through their role or through being in the largest group, think there is less of an issue, how can we kind of break down that barrier and sort of bring about that change and make the majority group realize that it's not the same for everybody?
I'm happy to jump in first. I went to a really interesting HR conference a few years ago, where all of the speakers were like the big HR directors from some of the big corporate organizations, and they'd been doing this work for like 20 years, and they were talking about the fact that we're not shifting the dial, and why we're not shifting the dial. And the conclusion to the discussion was, a lot of DEI work is about empowering those who are marginalized, as opposed to raising consciousness in those who are dominant. And if we actually stopped empowering people of colour and people who are women and people who are disabled to navigate the obstacles and the adversities within the workplace, and we actually paid attention to the gatekeepers, the people who are sat in the positions of power, and did work on them to be more conscious, more aware, and to act as allies, that would actually change the status quo. And I think that's something for us to really think about, because otherwise, I've done it myself, where I used to run some of the DfE funded big women leadership programs and global majority programs, where we empowered and upskilled, but they hit the same systemic barriers. And if anything, were more frustrated, because they were even more aware of the systemic and structural societal barriers. So I think there's a piece there for us to think about. When we frame DEI training, we talk about the 3 C's: consciousness, confidence and competence. And we quite often jump to the competence, that bias for action, finding our solutions to our problems, doing the doing, sorting out the curriculum. That works almost easier or safer because it's in service of the children, but actually it's the consciousness piece that is often missing. So where is the training, the awareness to really illuminate the term that Jörgis shared in the data, the perception gap? There's a massive perception gap where we have groups of stakeholders who feel safe, still feel seen, feel valued, have a high level of belonging, and they assume that everyone else in their school is experiencing the workplace in the same way, but they're not. And they're blissfully unaware that they're experiencing their school in that way because they are white, because they are straight, because they are able-bodied. And having that awareness, that empathy, that listening to the lived experience of people who sit elsewhere in the structure, but also hold different identities, to me, that's the bit we're not doing. We're not listening enough, and we're not disrupting the power dynamic enough.
Yeah, just to follow on from what Hannah said, and what Hannah said really resonated, and I wrote a blog for Diverse Ed about what it feels like leading DEI, especially as, you know, a South Asian Muslim woman, because it is great that your voice is being amplified, but it's exhausting. And especially when you do put yourself in a vulnerable position in many ways, because you are still up against the systemic barriers that Hannah just mentioned. And I would say, in terms of the difference in those in that data set, when I looked at it, I think a lot of it comes down to understanding as well what impact and EDI work is. So sometimes, and this isn't like you know, I don't want this to come across as like a blame game or any kind of like negative criticism. It's more kind of constructive in that events and highlighting days and, you know, putting new resources onto the curriculum, and of course what we've just said, bringing people in, is really important and necessary. That's not the only part of the work that needs to be done. It has to then have an impact on policy and the semantics within your recruitment packs. What is it that if I as a teacher was having issues, or if I felt psychologically unsafe, or, you know, imposter syndrome was kicking in an intersectional way for me as a Muslim woman, as I just said, how are your policies and practices going to support me, to retain me? Who can I go to within the organization who isn't necessarily also Muslim and Asian? Because that's the other thing I experienced, is that being the person that I am, and because of my protected characteristics and my identity, people like me would come to me to speak, because I am a, you know, safe space for them in many ways. However, we need to create you need to, I think schools and all organizations really, even working at a university, which is something that we work on a lot within human resources, is how is it that our policies and the impact, the actual strategic impact, is actually visible and being seen as in action. And some of that comes down to training line managers and supporting people specifically in management and those conversational spaces on how to have these conversations, how to spot the signs of discrimination, microaggressions, and you can start big and small. And I think, but then also helping and supporting line managers and people in those positions of responsibility to follow through, and so that your employees with protected characteristics, and, you know, pretty much every, you know, we have an inclusion passport strategy where every employee, and we're launching it later this year, has an inclusion passport, which is and they're allowed to fill it in if they would like, but it's effectively, what is it that they would need, what is it that we just need to be mindful of, and that could be shared with a student, and it's going to be for staff and students. It can be shared with a line manager, it could be shared with your team, just to start that conversation piece and to help people have look at impact of strategies. Because it's all well and good saying we are, you know, we've got an EDI strategy, we are doing X, Y, and Z. I just think it's important for people to see the impact, and that's where I think, like Hannah said, it's, you know, what are our, you know, white able-bodied colleagues doing to potentially support and also then enable and you know, show solidarity with their colleagues with protected characteristics.
Yeah, fabulous. And I think you sort of touched on the answer to Priya's question a little bit there, but I'll mention it again because I think it's worth noting. Zahara, you talked about kind of your experience as a Muslim woman and feeling that you're kind of, breaking down those barriers between you and other marginalized groups, and feeling like you're the voice of the Muslim women. And Priya's question here is around where there is a lack of racial diversity across the staff body, how do we make sure that we achieve better staff psychological safety to help with that retention, and to help those people in those marginalized groups feel like, whether they're the only person or they're of that background or not, they are welcome and they are in a safe space. You're muted, Sahara.
Sorry. Okay, sorry. Yeah, sorry. I've just read the question. Yes, it is a great question. I think it's around creating, and I think like Brene Brown said on a podcast really recently that she's moving away from the phrase psychological, like safe spaces, because, and she quite rightly said, who is it safe for? So safe for who in those spaces? So again, inviting and creating those spaces for people with protected characteristics, or, you know, in this case, you know, from marginalized staff from different racial backgrounds. You are putting yourself in a vulnerable position, and looking at, in terms of that space, looking at the dynamics within that space, the people in that space, who is it safe for? And I thought that was a really great question to ask about safe spaces and diversity networks that we might have in schools or workplaces. And instead calling them courageous spaces where people can come and talk, and you want people from a range of backgrounds, really. So it's really about, again, the semantics of how you are creating those courageous spaces, and also the questions, and I think it really helps to frame the space too. So yes, it's psychologically safe, yes, it's courageous, but from my experiences in terms of connecting and building those relationships within those spaces, it can help frame them to begin with questions, with topics, with things that people would like to, or you feel, you know, your organization needs to talk about. Having people from SLT there, I think, really helps. So schools are SLT. At the university, we've recently held, well, it is an event, but it was held where the Vice Chancellor was part, you know, I got the Vice Chancellor on it to actually speak around the issues. And it was to commemorate and talk about how far we've come in higher education since the tragic murder of George Floyd, and allowing your employees to, especially I think your employees of colour, to sit back and listen to, in this case, you know, our Vice Chancellor, who is white male, talk about allyship and solidarity, was really powerful. And also it then encourages others, like kind of going back to what Priya says, encourages others to contribute and again, courageously talk about their experiences. But I'll hand over to Hannah now.
No, if I could just add, and also I think we need to be clear on what we're talking about here when we're talking about safe spaces, because I think for me, there's different spaces that need creating, co-creating, and have different purposes. So affinity group spaces is very much where people who are in a marginalised group want to create a space to network and share lived experience with other people from that identity group. They don't want SLT in the room listening. They don't want people who are in dominant identity groups listening. That is about creating support and nurture and finding solutions within the group, and as opposed to the dominant group telling us we're going to have that space. I think sometimes the hierarchy is further perpetuated if it's the institution saying, here's this space, people don't actually want to go to that space. So I think there's something there to be mindful of. Whereas the ERG space, the employee reference group, that's more of an advisory capacity where we are creating space to listen to and learn from representatives of those different identity groups. And I think we probably need both. I think and it's quite hard depending on how big your school is or your trust is, you might not have capacity to do both. That's where you need to be aware of signposting out to where those spaces already exist. So affinity groups exist for all of the protected characteristics on social media across the country and beyond. So being aware of them so you can signpost staff to become part of that wider community and have that belonging within the sector, that bit's already there. Whereas the ERG is the people who are actually salaried within the workplace to make sure that we are consulting. So I've been doing a big bit of work with SWIFT, the Southwest Institute for Teaching, they've got 285 schools, I think it is, across the West Country. They've already got ECF provision and MPQ provision, but they're launching an ICT provision in the next 18 months. And they wanted DEI to be very central to the work they're doing. So it's very much a thread from the get-go about everything they're doing, everything they're setting up, all of their recruitment models, all of their curriculum mapping, all of their policies, all of their processes. It's not an afterthought, it's not a bolt-on, it's not saying tokenistic. And they've already had great feedback from people who have applied for jobs or applied for their courses, because they can see this real visible commitment, but also active commitment. And they're signposting out to where all of those spaces are, but they're also thinking about the role models or the real models they're bringing into that space as well. So I think it's about breaking down and being really aware of who's deciding what space we're creating, who owns it, who's empowered in it, what's its purpose, is it a safe space where the information stays in the room, or is it being used strategically as an advisory group? They could use the ERG group to look at the next set of adverts and think about how inclusive are these adverts. And going back to, I think the question was from Hilary in the chat earlier on about diverse recruitment. I think it's an interesting one for us to think about, that the system's become a little bit obsessed with diversifying the workforce, diversifying leadership, diversifying who's working where. If we're not inclusive, we can recruit diverse people, but they're not going to stay, and they're not going to flourish, and they're not going to thrive, and they're not going to belong. We actually need to do the harder work of thinking, how inclusive is our workplace, how inclusive are we as an employer, how inclusive are our policies and our practices. Pay attention to that bit and then do the diversifying. Otherwise, I think it can get it can almost create a bigger tension and more conflict longer term.
Thank you, Hannah. And I see a couple more questions, but I just want to dive in on the leadership discussion for a sec, because yeah, we've talked about kind of the idea that those in a leadership role are more likely to believe that their workplace is committed to EDI. Zahara, you mentioned likely because they know about all the policies that are in place, and they know that there is work going on at the strategic, at the structural level that is focused on equality, diversity and inclusion, and is focused on these matters. But if it's not having that impact, and it's not kind of feeding through into the kind of the feelings of those that these policies are supposed to be supporting, then kind of there's something missing a bit there. And I wonder, I know, Zahara, you talk about kind of difficult conversations, and Hannah, I know you have kind of a lot of experience in this space. What would you say to a senior leader who or to anybody in that space? How do you broach that conversation and say you're not being the ally that you think you are, or the way that you're kind of presenting yourself here, or the way that you're kind of talking about these issues is actually quite harmful for people? What's the best way to approach that kind of difficult conversation?
I think context matters as well when it comes to difficult conversations, because going back to the psychological safe spaces, or just courageous and brave spaces, if, like Hannah said, you have, I think in the workplace, because we have the conversations around diversity and inclusion, and uncomfortable and difficult conversations is moving forward, whereby we are seeing, or in my experience and with from schools and other organizations, people are having those conversations within their team. So connection and relationships are really important contextually when it comes to, I think, having the difficult conversations, and equally thinking about what you want the result of the conversation to be. So it kind of goes back to what Hannah was saying, and I think Priya and Haroop have highlighted in the chat, which is what is it that the result, or what do we want out of this? Is it a safe space for a conversation where people need that space to talk to people that they relate to, or that they feel safe with? And usually that comes down to relationships and context. If the conversation is in terms of contextual, and we're thinking of policy and practice, and it is a conversation about harassment, discrimination, promotion, access to being the only person who is leading DEI work, when DEI work is the responsibility of all, consistency across the organization, I think it's really important to set that conversation up with a line manager, or I would always say a senior manager in terms of impact, to then be able to address the situation. So contextualize it and address the situation, refer back to, and this is where I guess policy and the consistency and the transparency in how you would follow through with discrimination and a lack of belonging within your workplace. I always think it's very useful to fall back on not fall back on, but use that to support the conversation. So you're supported in the semantics of what, as an organization, have you committed to? So what commitment have you made to EDI inclusion? And as a member of the organization, we've all committed to that. So then saying how that commitment isn't being met, but how as an organization you're going to work through that in terms of what things are available to support inclusion, reminding people of our commitment. And also, I guess it gets very difficult when there are times where disciplinary procedures have to be followed through. So I think it's really important to, again, create that space where you are contextualizing the situation and then also following through with kind of the discriminatory procedure if it gets to that. So I think, going back to your original question, it does depend on the conversation. It depends on what the expected result and what the expectation is, but also from a context, from a wider standpoint, as everybody's here today because, you know, their schools and their organizations are committing to being more inclusive. So going back to like what Hannah was saying, which is we can recruit diversely, but that if those policies and practices aren't then inclusive and we're not following through with them, that's where the difficult conversations become even more difficult. Does that help? Does that?
Yeah, I think that was good. Hannah, is there anything you'd like to add on the kind of difficult conversation allyship front?
I think I'll add in and just responding to some of the things that Priya's put in the chat there, that what we're seeing is a lot of consequences, a lot of sanctions, a lot of people being held to account for saying or doing the wrong thing, whether that's a pupil body or staff body at the moment, because there is greater awareness. It often feels very responsive, very reactive, and people are being held to account, which they need to be done. I would invite you all to think about how we flip that on its head and do this work proactively. Like, how are we actually training everybody to take responsibility and have these conversations? How are we training our line managers to be able to navigate some of these things that quite often it's only when something goes wrong they get the support? So if we can flip that and preempt it and prevent it, and the language we use is about being proactive rather than reactive. And if I could give the parallels, like I was a teacher for 20 years, but if I think about the journey we've been on with moving from child protection to safeguarding, moving from compliance and legal kind of statutory responsibility to a culture of vigilance and a culture of shared responsibility, that's taken time to get that shift. Then we've had the journey when it comes to mental health and well-being. The Green Paper really invited us to move from being reactive and responsive to kids in crisis, to think about what can we do differently, what's the entitlement, where's the toolkit. I think DEI is kind of at the moment still in that reactive mode, and what we need to be thinking about is, over time, how do we preempt and prevent and be proactive about the skills and the competencies, the conscious and confidence we need to put in place to actually enable this work to embed in and become sustainable. And it takes a time. So Priya's point about we are constantly reacting. 3 years ago, it was anti-racist and George Floyd's murder. Now it's the DfE guidance around trans awareness. Next time it'll be something different. We're constantly doing that knee-jerk reactivity, and there's always going to be things we need to respond to, but we also need to be anchoring things down and sort of like almost having a strategic intent about how to move things forward concurrently.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And Claire's asked a question which I'm really pleased that she's asked, because actually not covered in the data that Yaga shared today, but in our initial research when we launched the survey 3 years ago now, we could see and actually we can see and hear that the differences in those who are disabled versus those who aren't disabled, and the difference in the experiences is actually the greatest difference of all of the protected characteristics. But what's not covered in the data that Yaga has shared is the proportion of those with a disability who have an invisible disability, which I apologize, I don't have the number off the top of my head, but I know it was most of those who reported having a disability, it was invisible. And so, yeah, Claire asked the question, what are we doing about tackling those? We talk about conditions for pupils and students, but the conversation isn't happening as much regarding staff.
It's a great question. I'll jump in on that one, Claire, because I provoke this one whenever I'm running training, that 1 in 5 people in UK society have a disability. That's 20% of our staff. And if we think about how much data we have about the children, how much we intentionally commit to doing to differentiate and personalise and find and remove barriers for the children to access the curriculum and to access school life, we do not have the same intent and commitment when it comes to the staff. And I think there's a couple of reasons here. Historically, people haven't wanted to disclose because of the fear of stigmatization, for the fear that by telling the school, the employer, they have an additional need, it might become a potential barrier in the future. And the more work we do with different school groups and stakeholder groups, the more disclosures we have in the training room of like almost like the guilt and the shame of I'm dyslexic, I'm autistic, I haven't told anyone because I thought it'd be used against me. And how do you, when you've been employed by an organization for like 10 years, then suddenly share that data? So I think there's a piece there about what data we're actually collecting and how do we infill that data. When we have that data, it's then what do we do with that data? And I think we really need to be intentional about in our schools. If you think about neurodiversity specifically, what do we do in the classroom to remove the barriers and to include and create access for neurodivergent young people? So if we then think about the adult experience, what are we doing in our meeting rooms? What are we doing in our training rooms to find and remove those barriers? I just don't see it happening enough. And I'll give the example. I'm organising 2 DEI conferences this week. I've got speakers for both from a range of different backgrounds talking about a range of different topics. We know that we've got a high proportion of people coming to the events who are neurodivergent. We asked for all the slides to be on early because those people need that access, and people haven't got their slides on early because they're focused on talking about racism. They're not thinking about the access and the inclusion of the people who are neurodivergent in their session. And I think we just really need to check ourselves on what are we doing to make those adjustments for the adults to actually support them on their journeys as well.
Yeah, and I would say I was doing quite a bit of work with students on with our neurodivergent students just before I left Beaconsfield High School, and we used students wanted to have their voice heard with regards to how they were feeling from the practical, all from walking into the classroom, engaging with their teachers to like the end of the school day, and they created webinars which was all their voice and we would then use those webinars internally for staff to see, and I think students, I guess what I found most recently is that students are in a great way, positive way, many were feeling, or they were willing to speak and talk about how they were feeling once they were welcomed. We welcomed them to the platform, and what that led to was staff then coming forward to say they were dyslexic, or they had ADHD, and it led to some really great conversations which were starting off small, so intimate conversations, all from staff, like for example a PE teacher saying, going to a training event, they're taking them longer to read through the material. Say for example there's a task and a CPD session, and it's taking them longer to read through the material, but being able to, like Hannah said, say that I just need a bit, this is what I would need to access this CPD session during the session. So the internal webinars were successful. We also had diversity champions, which I know have their pros and cons, but I do think practically when you're starting out, it really does help to have those intentional people who are willing within your organization they are willing to create the time. The organization has created the time for them to amplify and therefore build those courageous spaces around neurodivergent voices here, for example. And then the other thing that's really helping at the university is inclusion passports, which I think I mentioned earlier, which effectively you're giving the ownership to individuals to talk about and say, and they don't necessarily have to say it, they can write it, it can go into their email signature as a link, it can be stored in secure areas where you'd look to have meetings, so that the the other person within that meeting, or the other people within that meeting or session, would know what adjustments to make, and really committing to that on a consistent level are a few of the things that we found to be quite helpful and have been received positively.
Thank you very much, both of you. We've got 10 minutes left, so I'll start moving towards some of the kind of final questions. But as mentioned, yeah, please do keep posting questions in the chat if you have them, and we'll try to get to them in the next 10 minutes. I want to change the topic slightly because Zahara, I know you've recently started a new position in a not completely different sector, but not within the kind of English school system anymore. And Hannah, I know you've been in education kind of for most of your career, but I wanted to ask if either of you could share anything around what's going on outside of the sector and where we are in the education sector on that journey. Are we kind of leading, or what lessons can we take from outside of education?
I'd say we're dragging behind, Iona, let's be real. Like, I mean, I think just by talking to governors, we do a lot of DEI training for governing bodies, for trust boards who really want to understand what this means for a school context and how they can be those critical friends to the institution. And they're always quite staggered about things they assume should be in place in schools that they aren't, because based on their experience of the corporate world, some of these things were happening 10, 20 years ago. So I actually think our governors are a kind of an underused resource when it comes to understanding about DEI initiatives, strategies, policies and practices, because they've actually gone through all that training themselves. So thinking about building that bridge, I think, is really, really key. We get weird and wonderful requests from out of sector all the time. So we actually had a solicitors company in Buckingham reach out a couple of weeks ago. They've had a couple of major things happen, couldn't find any training. They know we work in education, would we go and support them? And actually a lot of these conversations in this training isn't sector specific. It's about culture, it's about behaviour, it's about language, it is about activating that shared commitment. So it's interesting. Just an observation, I'm not saying this to offside anyone, but it's really interesting that the majority of my clients are female bosses, female CEOs, female head teachers. And I think there's a real trend about who is leading on this work. And I always get really excited when I go into a room, whether it's a virtual room or an in-person room, and there's male representation in the room. So I think going back to Zahara's comment earlier on about blame culture, a lot of the white straight men who are educational leaders in my network have felt quite shut out of the conversation in the last few years. And I think it's really important that we create spaces for those conversations to happen with the adult stakeholders who identify in that way, but equally so the pupils. Our white straight boys in our schools feel quite disenfranchised from the conversation. So I think there's some things there for us to think about how we're creating space for all of those groups to navigate this journey as well.
And Zahara, anything from you?
Can you hear me?
Oh, yes.
Oh, sorry, I don't know what happened, sorry. Yeah, no, I was just going to say I completely agree with what Hannah was saying, that and I think I spoke to Hannah about it when I was moving into this new role. I was like, this is a whole new, and it's really going from an organization like a school, which, you know, I don't want to say it's like a family but it is, the community is so tight knit, and then going into an organization with over 1,000 employees, over 6,000 students, and leading on this work is overwhelming, to say the least. However, what I've realized in my very short time here is that there is so much crossover, and the conversations are exactly what we're having here, which is around impact, literally what Hannah just said about you know, even the comment that I said about blame culture, and you know, creating that culture for listening, I think, is very important too, because we have just like at schools, you know, you've got the groups, there are lots of networks. So even in organizations, like even if we think EY, Deloitte, there are loads of networks potentially, and some of the networks are brilliant in terms of the advice they offer. You know, I have friends and work with those organizations, and the advice that I get helps me personally and then professionally. But I think it's also about thinking the impact those networks are having, because I think in many ways you get to a point, and this kind of goes back to what we were saying about conversations, is that there are lots of conversations, there are lots of events happening. It is the people, like Hannah said, with the interest. Like I'm very honest, like with my protected characteristics, when the conversation is about race or religion, I do feel like I get more involved, sometimes because I feel like I have more to offer. I don't naturally, even degree wise, I'm drawn towards that that area of interest, which I also think is something that, you know, we also want to celebrate as well when we're celebrating diversity and inclusion within the organization. But what I found with talking to multiple networks is, and this is where I sit within HR now, and in schools it's SLT and governors and trust-wide, is okay, we're doing the sort of ground, like Hannah said, the grassroots work within the organization. How is that going to be sustained? How is that going to be followed through from a strategic and operational level higher up? Because I think that's really, that's a really difficult question. It's one where potentially you get more voices, more opinions, more barriers to overcome. So, and in order to support that, one thing that I've noticed, and we were doing, schools are doing it already, is looking at more granular data. I know data has its place, but I have found in terms of leading EDI, the more granular you get with your data, the better I found the impact and strategy is. When it comes to impact, but that's been my personal experience, and Hannah has way more experience than I do. So Hannah's also that from my experience, like so far, I found the granular data really helpful. So if schools can potentially, you know, work with Hannah at Diverse Ed to sort of even think about what data, you know, they would want to look at, and then even sometimes you have the data as a school, but interrogating it, you need that support with, and I used Hannah's support as well at school. So I think, and you know, I've also worked with the GEC, obviously Edurio as well, so like using your support is very helpful.
And just that Sahara and I are both English teachers. I think the question I always ask is, what story is the data telling me? And I think that's what today is really about, that you can have reams and reams of numbers and graphs and data, but what do we do with that information? And I think we need to stop harvesting and gathering it. If one more person does a piece of research about the experience of people of colour in education, I might lose my mind. Like, we know the situation, what are we going to do with that data? How are we going to actually activate and be proactive with that data to think about how we're going to like shift the dial and make a change and actually have that impact? So I think that's what we need to do now, is actually use the data and be really, really intentional and really, really specific, is what I'm hearing Sahara say there as well.
Yeah, I think that's right. Feeling a little bit scared, having started this session and saying we're going to be launching our full report on this research coming soon. But yeah, I think that's the point of sessions like today. We start with a little bit of the data for context, but now it's about what we're going to do with that information. Noting we've got 3 minutes left, I just want to give everyone on the chat an opportunity to unmute if they would like to. I know we've had some really kind of engaged participation, so I want to just pause for a moment and see if there's anyone on the chat that would like to just kind of pop up and share their thoughts.
Hi, yeah, I can add a few thoughts. Can you hear me okay? Yep, okay. Yeah, I just wanted to build on some of the work about data and some of the comments from Zara and Hannah. I think doing some intentional work with the people that you're sharing the data with is really, really pivotal in terms of how it lands, because most of the data that you will receive, you'll get majority based, you know, in favor of the work that we're doing, that is going really well, that we don't actually need to do something. So because we're embedded in this work, we often forget that other people need to be sort of educated on the fact that actually these are marginalized people, and they're going to sort of show the minority in that data, and it's still significant. So having sort of an organizational sort of approach to actually 5% is far too much, or we want 0% in this area, and explore that. And one thing that worked when I shared with senior leaders in my school and with the wider staffing body was I didn't share the data initially, the stats first. I shared some of the qualitative data, some of the stories, and that really hooked people in terms of, you know, this is an individual's experience. Is this what we want for our organisation? So that's one thing. And just another quick point, just in terms of when we think about DEI work, people are uncomfortable about talking about DEI. and it's because of their own personal experiences, or the fact that a lot of people don't want to offend other people. So it's creating that space to have those conversations. And as senior leaders, a lot of us do have training about how to have difficult conversations. We know about systems and strategic approaches and how we launch something new. And often in EDI work, we are quick to just appoint a DEI lead and just leave it all to them. But actually, we've got a lot of tools within us. We just need to overcome the edge. So, yeah.
Thanks ever so much. And I noted in the chat Hannah mentioning that she's rushing off to another appointment now. So I think we've already lost her. But yeah, we've hit the 12 o'clock mark. So we'll have to wrap up now. Zahara, just before we do, have you got a kind of 30-second summary, if you could? And I'm oversimplifying. What's the 30-second advice you could leave people with as we kind of leave the session today?
Well, just to reflect on what Haroop just said around reflecting on your qualitative and quantitative data and turning that into stories, and also thinking about, yes, EDI work with regards to the context of the safe spaces, the culture of belonging you're trying to nurture and who you're trying to nurture those spaces with. The real challenge comes when you will always get, like, people around this table are already committed, right? People in this chat, in this meeting, we're already committed, we're already interested. A percentage, how far down the line that is being met. I think the real challenge comes, and this is where your data really helps, is engaging those. And I think this might go back to, I think it was a question that Priya posed earlier on. How do you engage the people that don't, if we're being completely honest, don't want to engage? And that's where I think it comes down to your organizational vision and commitment that you've made, because it's a safeguarding, and to me it's safeguarding for both staff and students, whereby every member of that, and it's a very difficult question, it's a difficult conversation to have with regards to your EDI data. And equally, when you're hosting events, when you're having these sessions, who's attending, which departments potentially aren't, what are the conversations going on around? Tapping into that is really difficult, and it's a long-term aim. And that's where I think senior leadership, almost, or HR, if your school has that internally, need to come in to support and enable staff who are leading this work. So I think that's where the difficult work, almost this work should kind of begin or be sustained.
Great, thank you ever so much. And yeah, we were out of time and we're heading into the 30-minute lunch break now. But just before we end, I'll copy Ernest and recommend that everyone hop into the reactions part of the Zoom meeting and give a round of applause to everybody that has contributed today, either in the chat or as part of the conversation. Yeah, thank you ever so much. All of you will be rejoining the session at past while we'll be talking about culture in performance management. I hope you've enjoyed the session so far and look forward to the afternoon. Bye.